Senator Polley.
Thank you very much, Madam Acting Deputy President. Several months ago, I spoke in this chamber about the opposition's slide towards Tea Party-style tactics. I cited evidence showing that this development has distorted the coalition's decision-making on policies of national importance and led to a limitless strategy of obstructionism and defiance. In deciding to fight every day in Tea Party mode, no tactic has been deemed too petty or excessive. This week, the coalition reached a new low, denying a pair to a mother, Michelle Rowland, trying to return home and care for a sick 14-month-old child. Like the rest of Australia, I was stunned that the coalition had sunk this low.
Order.
But it's not just the coalition's stance on key issues or mean-spirited political tactics that we should be concerned about.
Order.
It is something.
Order.
It is something.
Order.
It is.
Thank you.
It is something that even more fundamental, the denigration of political debate in Australia that's being driven by the opposition leader and his team. In America, this sort of shrill, fear-driven campaigning led to the tragic shooting of a United States Congresswoman, Gabrielle Griffiths. How much further will the opposition leader go until his tactics lead to a similar disaster occurring in Australia? Already the political narrative, relentlessly pursued by the opposition leader and shadow treasurer, has unleashed responses in some sections of the public that is honestly quite frightening. This can be largely attributed to the fact that coalition politicians are free to associate themselves with Tea Party-style protests. Protests which place a premium on ignorance and disregard informed decision or discussion of policy or leadership. We should never forget Tony Abbott's call for people's revolt, which saw a series of aggressive demonstrations and a new type of political extremism in Australia. This, of course, led to the alternative leader of this country. This is the alternative leader of this country standing proudly in front of, I quote, "ditch the witch" placards at a time when death threats were sent to independent MPs. That's the calibre of the opposition. At one anti-carbon price rally in July 2011, some participants suggested to the shadow treasurer...
Order.
At the one anti-carbon price rally in July 2011, some participants suggested to the shadow treasurer that Australians should, and I quote, "take up arms against the government." What sort of hysterical pitchfork-carrying nonsense is this? The look on Joe Hockey's face was one of alarm. Alarm at just what his party has unleashed in Australia. Now it's out of control and these voices are growing louder. We saw it when the protesters swarmed outside Minister Albanese's electorate office in Sydney and hurled abuse at him, calling him a maggot, amongst other things. Members of the coalition, including the member for Indy, Sophie Marabella, were right there next to them, right next to the protesters carrying placards that read, and I quote, "tolerance is our demise, and carbon dioxide is not pollution." Perhaps the worst offender has to be the Consumers and Taxpayers Association, or CATA, the group responsible for many of these hate-filled public events in recent times. This includes those protests featuring the infamous, and I quote, "ditch the witch" placards I mentioned a moment ago. Although Tony Abbott has since distanced himself slightly, in March this year we still had Barnaby Joyce and Liberal member for Hughes, Craig Kelly.
You need to refer to people in the other place or here by their correct title.
My apologies. Senator Barnaby Joyce and Liberal member for Hughes, Craig Kelly, proudly addressing, and I quote, "rotten to the core" rally. I shouldn't have to remind Senator Joyce and Mr Kelly that this group has covered themselves in glory on numerous occasions the last couple of years. The group's spokesperson stated publicly that the furor over Alan Jones, and I quote, dead of shame comment was an overreaction and that Jones was subject of cyberbullying. They have hurled abuse at the elected Prime Minister of this country during question time. They've perpetrated climate change denialism.
Order.
The list goes on, and the coalition is right next to them every step of the way. This trend of extremism, political activism, embraced by the coalition, comes at a huge cost to Australia. Tony Abbott has sought to consistently undermine the government's efforts to reasonably manage the Australian economy, and has done this in part by lowering the tone of the debate at every turn. Remember, it was Labor's response to the global financial crisis that saved hundreds of thousands of jobs and small businesses in this country. It was praised by Nobel Prize-winning economists and ensured that Australia did not slide into recession. Our economy has a gold-plated AAA credit rating. This is the envy of countries around the world. But all we have heard from the opposition is a series of breathtakingly stupid comments. We had the Shadow Treasurer saying that the Australian economy is, and I quote, flatlining, even though it has grown considerably. He also regularly implies that running a $1.5 trillion national economy is not dissimilar from running a household budget. This is, of course, part of a wider trend when it comes to the economy and a range of other issues the senior coalition leaders tried to sound like everyday people. I think that if I hear Tony Abbott say the words fair dinkum...
You need to refer someone in the other place by their correct title.
I think that if I hear Mr Abbott say the words fair dinkum one more time, I'll vomit. We also need to consider that the coalition's fixation on the ignorance is damaging Australia's strong international reputation as a progressive and dynamic middle power. When Echo Money magazine awarded its prestigious Finance Minister of the Year award to Treasurer Wayne Swan, the Shadow Treasurer basically threw his toys out of the pram. Let's not forget that he made several telling remarks, including his gem when discussing past winners, and I quote directly, in 2001 there was a Pakistani Finance Minister. This is quite an extraordinary one. That one. Well, if the Shadow Treasurer had conducted any semblance of research, he would have found that the Pakistani minister in question could have potentially headed up Citibank in New York. Instead, he returned to Pakistan to institute successful economic reforms. Extraordinary indeed. Sometimes it seems like every time the opposition leader opens his mouth, he tarnishes the country's image. He has publicly laminated the fact that the Prime Minister won't, and I quote, lie down and die, and stated that the science behind climate change is absolute crap. I think even his own party cringed when he said that in September last year that the Prime Minister should be talking to the Indonesian President in Jakarta rather than swanning around in New York talking to Africans. How embarrassing. This was despite the fact that the Prime Minister was attending the annual 4-day Assembly of the United Nations, which also being attended by the President. Mr Abbott and senior members of his party have been raising the bar of stupidity and is to the detriment of the political discourse in this country. This means that moderate members of the Liberal Party are quickly becoming an endangered species. They must look on it in horror every time they witness their leader pursue his chief strategy. Give me the Prime Ministership or I will wreck the joint. This is no nuance, no thoughtful opinion, no well-constructed arguments or invitation to challenge the merits of an idea. Instead, they rely simplistically mantras like stop the boats or great big new tax. It's vicious, crude and cheap, and it demonstrates that the Abbott coalition is the political soulmate of the Republican Party. The Liberals' strategy is to make politics a policy-free zone, and by unleashing their attack dogs and fomenting this culture of ugly protest, the opposition has redefined political demonstrations in Australia. How on earth has this come to be? And tonight, when we heard the budget in reply, what did we get? We got more of the same. Negativity, denying that there's any need to address climate change. It was more of the same. And we know on this side, as the Australian public already know, and we will educate them about the challenges ahead they will face under any incoming coalition government, and that is their attack on Australian workers and what they will do in bringing back Work Choices Mark III. So I urge...
Order.
We know what Tony Abbott's history was when he was Minister for Health. He gutted the health department by $1 billion. $1 billion.
Time has expired. Order.